Nobody noticed what Nora Hadley was doing in the mornings. She woke before the sun dressed in the dark and walked across frozen ground to the barn before the valley had enough light for a neighbor to see her from the road. She carried a bucket out each morning. Not a water bucket, not a feed bucket. She carried it full of dirt, walked it to the low places in the yard, and spread the earth evenly before walking back inside. She did this every day for 3 weeks in October of 1886. To anyone passing on the dirt road that cut through the valley, the Hadley place looked like every other homestead in the territory. Weathered timber walls faded gray by sun and wind. A peaked roof patched where it needed patching. A wide sliding door on the barn that groaned when you pushed it open. The kind of property a man would ride past without turning his head. But beneath that barn floor, something was being built that the valley had never seen. Nobody knew. And if they had known, they would not have let her finish it. Nora Hadley was 32 years old and had been a widow for 18 months. Her husband James had died in February of 1885, 6 weeks after a lung sickness settled into his chest and refused to leave. He had been a carpenter by trade, a quiet man from Ohio who had believed when they came to Montana territory that a man with good hands and a willingness to work hard could build something that would last. He had been right about most things. He had not been right about his own lungs. The cabin James built was like most cabins in the territory. Rough pine logs stacked one over the other, gaps chinked with mud and moss that shrank in the cold and let the wind find its way through. A single main room with a small sleeping loft above. A stone fireplace built more for cooking than heating, the kind of fireplace that fills a room with smoke if you feed it too fast and fills it with cold if you don't feed it enough. The floorboards were laid straight down onto packed dirt. No foundation, no crawl space. Just boards between the living family and the frozen ground beneath. In winter, frost crept upward through those boards like something alive. Ice formed on the inside face of the window glass. The children slept under every quilt. Nora owned their breath visible in the dark air above their faces. And even with a fire burning in the corner, the cold in that cabin was a presence you could feel as a weight on your skin. But it was the wind that was the true enemy. Montana wind does not simply blow. It searches. It finds every weak place in the chinking, every gap where a log has dried and pulled away from its neighbor, every loose board and cracked corner, and it pushes through those places with a patience that no amount of rags or moss can fully stop. Nora had spent the first winter alone, stuffing cloth into every seam she could find. She had hung blankets along the walls. She had done everything the women at church had told her to do. Still the cold came, and still it nearly took little Annie from her. Annie was 6 years old, and she was the reason everything that followed happened. The cough had started in January of that first winter, alone the winter after James died. It began as a dry scratch in the back of the girl's throat and turned within 2 weeks into something wet and heavy that shook her small body each time it came. Nora could hear it through the night, a sound like something tearing in slow motion, and she sat by the fire counting every breath her daughter took in the silence between. She burned through half her wood supply before March arrived. She fed that fire around the clock, rising every 2 hours through the night to push another log in, because the moment the fire dropped below a certain point, the cold closed back in from every wall at once. It was a war fought in 2-hour intervals, and Nora was fighting it alone. Annie survived, but on the worst nights it had not felt certain. There was one night in particular, deep in the middle of February, when the wind had been screaming for 3 days without pause and the temperature had dropped to a place where Nora's thermometer, the small brass one James had brought from back east, had nothing left to report. She sat on the floor beside Annie with the girl's hand in both of hers, listening to the labored pull of each breath, watching the small chest rise and fall with an effort that no child should have to make. Owen was 8 years old and usually slept through everything, but that night he woke up. He climbed down from his pallet in the loft and stood at the top of the ladder looking at his mother on the floor below, and in the firelight his face had the look of a boy who has understood something. He wasn't ready to understand. He said, "Mama, is Annie going to die like Papa did?" Nora did not look up from her daughter's face right away. She held the question inside for a moment, feeling its full weight before she answered. "No," she said, "because I'm going to figure out how." She had no idea what that meant when she said it. She only knew that it had to be true because the alternative was something she could not allow herself to think about in that room on that floor with that child's hand in hers. Owen climbed back up to his pallet. Nora stayed where she was until morning. And somewhere in those dark hours, sitting between the fire and the cold, she began to think in a direction she had never thought before. James had told her something once in the early months after they arrived in Montana, when they were still learning what the land was and what it asked of the people who lived on it. He said it simply the way he said most things without drama or decoration. He said, "Nora, this country isn't like Ohio. You can't build here the way people taught you to build back east. You have to learn from the ground." At the time, she had understood it as advice about carpentry, about timber and soil, and the particular way frost moved through Montana earth. She had not understood it as anything larger than that. James left behind three things of value when he died: a small wooden toolbox with his initials carved into the lid, the brass thermometer, and that sentence. For 18 months after he was gone, she had used the toolbox and the thermometer. The sentence she had stored in the back of her mind without quite knowing what to do with it. She was starting to know. The barn was smaller than the cabin, 20 feet by 16, with two horse stalls along the north wall and a storage area for hay in the loft above. It was not a remarkable structure by any measure, but in the deep cold of that first winter alone, Nora noticed something while doing the evening feeding. It was warmer inside the barn than it was inside the cabin. Not dramatically warmer, not warm in the way a fire-heated room is warm, but there was a difference that she could feel in her hands and the air on her face, and it was consistent. Night after night, when she came out to check on the animals in the worst of the cold, the barn offered a degree of relief that the cabin did not. She began paying attention to why. Two horses and a milk cow occupied those stalls every night, and their bodies generated heat the way any living thing generates heat. Their breath added moisture that took some of the edge off the cold air. The hay stacked high in the loft above acted as a layer of insulation between the interior space and the roof. And critically, the north side of the barn had been built against a rise in the ground, a natural berm of earth that Edward Crane, who had helped James site the structure, had recommended for exactly this reason. The earth on the north wall blocked the worst of the wind before it ever reached the timber. In January, with Annie feverish under blankets, Nora had done something she did not tell anyone about. One night she carried the girl out to the barn bundled in quilts and laid her down on a bed of clean straw near the cow's stall. She sat beside her through the night, not sleeping, just watching and waiting. Annie slept more deeply that night than she had in weeks. In the morning, for the first time in a long time, Nora did not hear the wet pull of the cough. Before she carried Annie back to the cabin, Nora held James's thermometer up in the barn, 47 degrees. Then she walked to the cabin and held it inside, 19 degrees. That was not a feeling or an impression. It was a number, a difference of 28 degrees between a space above ground and a space below. And Nora Hadley, who had never studied physics or engineering or any formal science at all, held that thermometer in the pale winter light and understood what James had meant. Not about carpentry, about everything. The ground itself held heat. At depth beneath the reach of frost and wind, the earth stayed at a temperature that the air above it could never touch. If you could build inside that depth, if you could put walls of stone and pack soil around a living space and use the earth itself as insulation, you would not be fighting the cold anymore. You would simply be below it. This understanding is the whole foundation of what Nora built, and it needs to be said once clearly. Soil at a depth of 6 to 7 feet maintains a steady temperature near 50 to 55 degrees year-round, regardless of what the air above is doing. Combined with the radiant heat of livestock overhead and hay acting as a ceiling insulator, a properly built underground room could sustain a livable temperature through a Montana winter on almost no additional fuel. Nora did not know the scientific terminology. She knew the number on the thermometer, and she trusted it. She began digging in the first week of October 1886. She chose the center of the barn floor away from the stalls where the animals made their mess, and she removed the boards, carefully stacking them against the wall so they could be replaced if needed. The first morning she dug for 2 hours before the sun rose high enough to risk being seen. She filled one bucket, she carried it out, spread it in a low place near the fence line, and went inside to make breakfast for the children, as though nothing had happened. The next morning she did it again. On the fourth day, Owen followed her. He did not announce himself. He stood in the doorway of the barn, in the early gray light, watching his mother stand in a hole that now reached to her waist, swinging a shovel against the dark earth. He watched for a long moment. Then he said in the matter-of-fact tone that was very much his father's tone, "What are you building?" Nora looked up at him from the floor of the excavation. She considered several possible answers. Then she gave him the true one. "A warm room," she said, "for Annie." Owen considered this for the length of time it takes a boy to understand that his mother has already decided and that the decision is not negotiable and does not require his approval. "I can pull the bucket," he said. From the next morning forward, Owen was at the barn before first light. He would grip the rope tied to the bucket handle and haul each load of dirt up while Nora dug below. They did not speak much. They worked in the rhythm that develops between people who are building something together. And when the sun rose far enough that a neighbor might see, they replaced the boards, scattered fresh straw over them, and went inside. 3 weeks passed. The hole grew. In the fourth week, after a heavy rain came through the valley overnight, Nora descended into the unfinished chamber before feeding the animals and found water standing in the far corner. The eastern wall was weeping. She stood in the cold dark looking at the water and felt something she had been keeping at bay since she started. Doubt. Not doubt about the idea. The idea was sound. She had tested it. She had the numbers to prove it. But doubt about herself, about whether one woman with a shovel and a bucket and no one to consult could actually build something that would hold under the pressure of a Montana winter. James would have known what to do about a weeping wall. She had watched him work enough times to know that he would have looked at it for a moment, run his hand along the stone, and told her exactly what was needed. James was not here. She sat down on the earthen floor and put her back against the dry section of the wall and looked at the water in the corner for a long time. Her hands were cracked open from the cold, and the skin round her knuckles split in dark with dried blood. She pressed one hand flat against the earth beside her and felt the steady, indifferent warmth of it, 50-something degrees, patient, not panicking, just there. She picked up the shovel. It took 2 days to fix the drainage problem. She dug a narrow channel along the base of the eastern wall and filled it with gravel hauled up from the creek bed, creating a path for water to follow away from the living space and into a deeper sump at the far end of the chamber. She reinforced the soil behind the stone in that corner, packing it tight and angled to direct moisture downward. When it was done, she poured a bucket of water along the wall and watched where it went. It went where she had told it to go. She would remember this later, not as a moment of triumph, but as the moment she understood what it actually meant to build something. You plan, and then the ground tells you what you missed, and you fix it, and you continue. That was all. It was not complicated. It was just work. The walls were built from flat stones gathered from the creek bed over several evenings, sandstone and limestone, that she loaded into the wagon and hauled back in loads small enough not to attract comment. She stacked them without mortar, setting each stone with a slight inward lean so that gravity would hold the courses together, and packed dark earth tight behind each course to seal out moisture. The floor she tamped hard with the back of the shovel and sloped gently toward the gravel sump. For the ceiling, she salvaged heavy beams from a collapsed shed on the eastern edge of the property, beams thick enough to carry the weight of the barn floor above the 2 horses, the cuss, and the 8 feet of stored hay that sat above all of it. The entrance was a trap door 3 feet square cut into the barn floor and fitted with boards that lay flush with the surrounding planks. From inside the barn, it was invisible unless you knew to look for the slight seam. A short ladder led down into the chamber. For ventilation, she shaped a clay pipe from drainage tiles 8 inches wide, running from the ceiling of the chamber up through the wall of the barn and emerging on the exterior as what appeared to be a simple vent. Air could move. In one corner, she built a small hearth lined with fire brick she had traded for at the general store in Lewistown, just large enough to warm the surrounding stone on a cold evening. The real heat, the steady heat, would come from the earth and from the animals above. By mid-November, the room was finished. There was a Sunday in early October between the drainage problem and the completion of the walls, when Nora stood in the churchyard after services with the other women of the valley and heard something she was meant to hear. She had not been trying to listen. She was watching Owen and Annie through the church window where the children had stayed inside out of the cold, and she was thinking about the angle of the drainage channel and whether she had the right slope on the run. Then Ruth Crane's voice reached her from the small group of women standing nearby, carrying with the clear quality of a voice that knows it is being heard. "I understand she's been sleeping in the barn," Ruth said, not unkindly, with genuine concern in her voice, the kind of concern that is also by its nature a judgment. Someone ought to look in on her. Poor thing. Nora kept her eyes on the window. She felt the words land, felt the shape of them, felt the way they rearranged how she would be thought of in this community from this point forward. She was no longer the widow who was managing. She was the widow who had lost her footing. She turned and looked at Ruth Crane directly, and said in a voice that carried no more and no less than it needed to, "Thank you, Mrs. Crane, I'm managing fine." Ruth smiled the smile of a woman who does not believe what she has just been told but is too polite to say so. Nora kept the word poor in her mind that evening, not with bitterness, but with the precise attention she gave to problems that needed solving. Kindness and accuracy were different things, and the word meant at its root that something was lacking. She was not lacking, she was building. There was a difference, and before long, the valley would see it. Thomas Aldridge came to the Hadley place on a Tuesday in late October. He came alone without his wife, which told Nora this was a business call. Thomas Aldridge was 55 years old and had been in Montana longer than almost anyone in the valley. He was not a cruel man. Nora understood that, and it mattered because it meant that what he was about to say came from genuine belief rather than calculation. He sat at the table in the cabin and put his hat on his knee and looked around the room with the eyes of a man who has seen what Montana winters do to underprepared people. He made his offer carefully and fairly. He would buy the land at a reasonable price. He would allow Nora and the children to remain in the cabin as tenants for as long as they needed at minimal rent while she made arrangements. He was not trying to take anything. He was trying in his way to prevent a disaster he was certain was coming. "I've been in this territory 20 years, he said. "I know what a winter here can do to a family that isn't prepared. I have the resources to help, and it seems like the right thing to do." Nora looked at him across the table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said the thing that changed the conversation. "I buried my wife in March of 1871, Thomas said. His voice was level, but the level was the kind that requires effort to maintain. She was 31 years old. The winter took her, same as it takes a lot of people here who weren't ready for it. I am not making this offer to take anything from you, Mrs. Hadley. I'm making it because I have seen where this goes, and I'd rather give you a way out before it does." The room was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at Thomas Aldridge, at the lines of his face and the way he held his hat, and she understood something about him that she hadn't understood before. He was not wrong about what Montana winters could do. He had firsthand terrible proof of that. His mistake was that he looked at her and saw his wife, the woman he had not been able to save, and he was trying 15 years later to save her instead. "Thank you," Nora said. "I won't be selling." Thomas nodded slowly, the nod of a man who expected this answer but felt obligated to try. He put his hat on and stood. At the door he stopped and turned back, and he said, "Your husband was a good man. I hope you know I mean this as a neighbor, not as someone trying to take advantage." "I know that," Nora said, and she did. After he left, she stood at the window and watched his horse move down the road until it disappeared behind the cottonwoods. Then she went to the barn and climbed down into the half-finished chamber and sat in the quiet, in the dark, and felt the temperature of the earth against her palms. He might still be right. That possibility sat in her chest like a stone. He had experience she did not have. He had stood where she was standing and watched it go wrong anyway. But he had not been in this hole. He had not held this thermometer. He did not know what she was building because no one did. She picked up her shovel and went back to work. By the middle of November, when the first true cold settled into the valley, the chamber was complete. Nora brought the children's bedding down the rope bed and a straw mattress for herself, 2 small pallets. For Owen and Annie, the folding table, the oil lamp, the quilts. The space was 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, with a stone ceiling 7 feet above the earthen floor. The walls were dark and close, and the lamp threw soft yellow light against them. Annie stood at the top of the ladder and looked down and said, "It looks like a bear's den." Owen, already halfway down the ladder, said without looking up, "Warmer than a bear's den." Nora lit the small hearth fire for the first time. She fed it for 1 hour, just enough to warm the stone around the firebox and let the heat begin to spread into the chamber walls. Then she let it drop to coals. She hung James's thermometer from a nail beside the ladder. 55 degrees. Outside the barn, the temperature was falling through 18 and heading lower. That night, all 3 of them slept through without waking once. No fire to tend, no cold creeping up through the floor, no wind finding the gaps in the walls. Just the steady, indifferent warmth of the earth and the quiet sound of the horses shifting in their stalls overhead, and the deep, untroubled breathing of 2 children who did not know what their mother had spent 3 weeks building beneath them. Nora lay in the dark for a long time before she slept. She thought about James's sentence, "You have to learn from the ground." She thought about the 2 numbers on the thermometer, the difference she had held in her mind for months before she understood what to do with it. She thought about the drainage problem and the 2 days it had taken to fix it, and the way the water had gone where she told it to go. She thought about Thomas Aldridge standing at her door believing he was saving her. She thought, "I heard you, James." Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 18 months, she slept like a woman who was not afraid. What she did not know, lying there in the warmth of the ground while December moved toward the valley, was that the winter coming for them was not like other winters. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them, in the behavior of animals, in the particular color of the sky in the late afternoons, in the way the cold in early November had a finality to it that the old-timers recognized and did not talk about directly. Something was building out on the plains to the north, something that had been gathering itself for a long time, and it would arrive in January with a force that would test every roof and wall and fireside in the territory. Every one of them but one. December arrived in Montana the way a man arrives who has been watching from a distance for a long time, patient and certain, waiting for the moment when everyone has stopped looking at the door. The cold that settled into the valley in the first week of December was not the dramatic cold of a blizzard. It was the cold of permanence, of a temperature that drops and simply does not come back up, as though the thermometer has forgotten the upper half of its range. Frost stayed on the fence post past noon. The creek slowed, thickened, and went quiet. The sky turned the particular shade of white that old-timers in the valley described not as a color, but as an absence, the light going flat and directionless in a way that made distances hard to judge. Nora noticed the sky and said nothing about it to anyone. She had more immediate concerns. Isaac Webb came to the Hadley place on a Thursday in mid-December. He came on horseback and tied up at the fence post and knocked on the cabin door, which told Nora this was not a casual passing. Isaac Webb did not make unnecessary trips. He was 45 years old, a broad-shouldered man who had been farming in the territory for 15 years, and he knew the land, the way you only know something after it has hurt you enough times that you start paying careful attention. He had lost a crop to early frost, and a calf to a drainage problem in a low pasture, and 2 weeks of labor to a poorly sited well that hit clay instead of water. He had learned from all of it. He was not a man who dismissed things he did not understand, but he was also not a man who extended trust before he had examined the reason for it. He sat at Nora's table and accepted the cup of coffee she set in front of him, and said what he had come to say without softening it. "I've been hearing things," he said, "about what you've built under your barn. I'm not here to tell you what to do on your own property, but I've put foundations into this ground for 15 years, and there are things about the way water moves through Montana soil in spring that I don't think you could know unless someone told you, and I don't think anyone told you." Nora sat down across from him and listened. Isaac laid it out plainly. Spring thaw in this valley was not a gentle thing. When the snowpack released, the water moved through the upper soil in sheets, following grades and compaction lines that shifted from year to year. A chamber dug into the earth might hold all winter and fail completely in March, not because of anything wrong with the construction, but because of what the ground did when it let go of 6 months of frozen moisture all at once. He had seen root cellars flood. He had seen foundations heave. He had seen work that looked solid in December turn into a serious problem by April. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he said. "I'm saying you don't know what you don't know." The room was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at him steadily. She thought about the eastern corner, the one that had wept after the October rain, the 2 days she had spent fixing the drainage channel while her hands bled. She thought about the gravel sump and the angle she had packed into the soil behind the stone. Then she said something that Isaac Webb had not expected. "You're right," she said. "Tell me what to watch for." He stopped. He had prepared himself for an argument or a dismissal. What he had not prepared for was a question. "Tell you what to watch for," he repeated. "In spring, tell me the signs. What does the ground do before it gives way? Where does the water come from? First, is there anything I can do now to make the drainage more reliable?" Isaac looked at her across the table for a long moment. Then he put his coffee down and started talking in a different register, entirely the register of someone who has been asked a real question by someone who intends to use the answer. They sat at that table for 2 hours. Isaac told her about the way meltwater traveled along clay layers that sat below the topsoil, how it moved laterally before it moved down, how a chamber built below a clay lens could fill from the sides before it ever showed water on the floor. He told her about the signs, the way the soil around a structure would soften unevenly, the way certain areas of a field would green up faster than others in March because the water was already moving beneath them. Nora listened to all of it. She asked 3 specific questions. She went to the barn twice while they talked, once to check the angle of her gravel channel and once to examine the base of the eastern wall by lamplight. When she came back the second time, she told Isaac what she had found, and he nodded slowly. You may be all right, he said with the careful tone of a man who is not ready to say more than that. But you'll want to watch the eastern corner. I know the eastern corner, Nora said. Isaac finished his coffee, stood, and pulled his coat on. At the door, he paused. I came here expecting you to argue with me, he said. I know, Nora said. That's why you came instead of just letting people talk. He looked at her for a moment, then went out without answering. She watched him ride back down the road and thought that Isaac Webb was the most useful kind of person, the kind who tells you things you don't want to hear, because they believe the truth is more valuable than your comfort. The day after Isaac's visit, Samuel Greer came. His arrival was different from Isaac's in a way that Nora felt before he said a word. Isaac had come with information. Samuel came with something heavier than information, something he had been carrying since October and had finally decided he could not carry alone anymore. He stood in the doorway of the barn while Nora was doing the evening feeding and said with no preamble, I told my wife about the blankets. In October, she told Ruth Crane. Nora set down the feed bucket and looked at him. I know, she said. I didn't think it would go the way it did. I know that too. Samuel Greer was a practical man, 40 years old, not given to lengthy self-examination. But he had spent 2 months living with the knowledge that a careless sentence spoken to his wife over supper had turned into a current of opinion running through the community, and that current had not been gentle to Nora Hadley. He had heard what Ruth said at the church. He had heard the word poor used too many times. He had watched Thomas Aldridge ride out to make his offer and come back alone, and he had felt each time the specific discomfort of a man who knows his hands are not entirely clean. I wanted to know you were all right, he said, and I wanted to say it to your face instead of just thinking it. Nora studied him for a moment. Then she said, Do you want to see what I built? She opened the trap door and held the lamp over the opening. Samuel looked down into the chamber at the stone walls and the earthen floor, and the small hearth in the corner, and then he came down the ladder. He stood in the chamber and felt the temperature settle around him, the cold of the barn releasing as he descended. He looked at the thermometer on the wall. He looked at the hearth, cold and dark in the middle of the afternoon. He looked at Owen's books stacked neatly on the small table, at Annie's extra quilt folded at the foot of her pallet. He did not say anything about the temperature or the construction. What he said, well, are the children well? Better than last winter, Nora said. Better than any winter since James. Samuel nodded. He stood there for another minute, just standing in the warmth of the ground with his hat in his hands. Then he said, I won't mention it to anyone again, what you're doing here. You can mention it if you want, Nora said. I'm past worrying about that. He looked at her. Then why are you telling me that? Because you came here to make something right, and I want you to know you did. She paused. Go home, Mr. Greer. Make sure your wood is stacked high. I think December is going to be shorter than we expect. He climbed out, replaced the boards behind him, and rode home in the early dark. Nora fed the animals and climbed back down and sat in the quiet of the chamber for a while before she called the children for supper. She had not told him what she meant by shorter than expected. She had not told anyone. Frances Cole came on her own without being invited on a Saturday afternoon in the third week of December. She was 34 years old and had been teaching the Valley's children for 6 years, and she had the particular quality of mind that develops in people who spend their days trying to understand how other people learn. She noticed things that other people walked past, not because she was more intelligent, but because she had trained herself to ask why when something didn't fit the pattern she expected. What had not fit the pattern was Annie Hadley. Frances had watched Annie for 2 winters. The previous winter, the girl had been pale and fragile, the kind of child you worried about, the kind whose absence from school on a cold Monday morning made you send someone to check on the family. This December, Annie was a different child entirely. Pink-cheeked and bright-eyed, running in the schoolyard with her coat half open while other children huddled near the building, eating her lunch with appetite, laughing. Children did not transform like that without a reason. And the reason was not medicine, because Nora Hadley could not afford the kind of medicine that would produce that result. The reason was something else. Frances knocked on the cabin door and asked Nora directly, "What have you changed?" Nora looked at her for a moment, the look of someone deciding how much of a door to open. Then she said, "Come with me." She took Frances to the barn. She opened the trap door. Frances climbed down without hesitation and stood in the chamber with her hands at her sides, taking it in. She did not exclaim or perform surprise. She looked at the walls and the ceiling and the drainage channel and the ventilation pipe and the thermometer, and she did what Nora had not expected anyone to do. She took a notebook from her coat pocket and started writing. "You don't mind?" she asked, already writing. "What are you writing?" Nora asked. "Everything," Francis said. "Dimensions, materials, the angle of the drainage, the position of the vent." She stopped and looked up. "Nora, do you understand what you've built here?" "A warm room," Nora said, "for my children." "Yes," Francis said, "and also a solution to the problem that kills people in this valley." She went back to writing. "I want this recorded so it isn't lost. Is that all right?" Nora stood at the base of the ladder and watched this woman she had known for 6 years, but had never understood quite this clearly before, and felt something shift inside her. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. The sense that what she had done in this hole in the ground had weight beyond what she had assigned it. "Write whatever you need," Nora said. Frances spent 40 minutes in the chamber. When she climbed out, she had 4 pages of notes covered in her neat school teacher's hand. She stood in the barn and looked at Nora and said, "If the winter is as bad as the signs are suggesting, these notes are going to matter." "What signs?" Nora asked. "The behavior of the elk," Frances said. "They've moved down lower and earlier than anyone can remember. The old hands are watching them and not saying much." She tucked the notebook into her coat. "They don't say much when they're worried." Nora thought about the color of the sky in late November, the particular absence of it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for showing me," Frances said. Christmas passed quietly on the Hadley place. Nora cooked what she had and kept the children occupied and tried not to spend too much time watching the sky. She had done what she could do. The chamber was ready. The wood she had was mostly reserved for the cabin, which she still used during the day, maintained as a normal household surface for the community to see. At night and in the worst cold, the family descended. In those December nights, lying in the chamber with Owen and Annie breathing steadily on their pallets, Nora sometimes thought about Thomas Aldridge's wife, the woman he had buried in March of 1871 at 31 years old. She thought about what it must have been like to be that woman in those last weeks in a cabin fighting the cold with whatever was available, with a husband doing everything he could and still watching the cold win. She did not feel superior to that woman. She felt connected to her. Both of them had faced the same enemy in the same territory. The only difference was a thermometer and a number and a sentence James had spoken years ago that had finally made sense. The first real sign came on the 3rd day of January. The wind changed direction in the middle of the afternoon, shifting from the northwest to a bearing that the cattle seemed to feel before any human instrument registered it. Nora's 2 horses stood at the back of their stalls, with their heads down and their ears flat, and the milk cow refused to eat her evening hay, standing instead with her body pressed into the corner of the stall as though she was trying to make herself smaller. Nora stood in the barn and watched the animals for a long time. Then she went back to the cabin and moved the last of the children's winter things down into the chamber. Extra oil for the lamp, the remaining dried goods from the cabin shelf. James's toolbox, for no reason she could have explained, except that she did not want to leave it above ground. She told Owen and Annie that night, as they were settling into their pallets, "We're going to stay down here for a while, until the weather passes." Annie asked how long. "As long as we need to," Nora said. She lay awake that night, listening to the absolute silence that had settled over the valley. The wind had stopped entirely. The cold had reached a depth where the air itself seemed to have frozen solid. In her experience, that kind of silence was not peace. It was the held breath before something loud. It came the next morning. The storm did not arrive like a wall of weather the way summer thunderstorms arrived. It came the way a tide comes in gradually, and then all at once the wind building through the morning hours, from a whisper to a moan, to a sustained howl that shook the barn boards above their heads, and sent the horses into a restless, rhythmic shifting that Nora could feel through the chamber ceiling as a series of low vibrations against the timber. By noon on the first day, the temperature outside had dropped below 0. Nora knew this not because she had a way to check it from the chamber, but because she climbed up to feed the animals mid-morning and felt the quality of the air through the barn walls, the way it hit the inside of her lungs with a sharpness that tells you everything you need to know about how cold is cold. She fed the horses, checked, the cow pulled down fresh hay, and descended back into the chamber inside of 15 minutes. The thermometer on the chamber wall read 54 degrees. Owen was reading by the lamp. Annie was asleep on her pallet in the middle of the afternoon, her color good, her breathing slow and even. Nora sat down at the table and listened to the storm working at the world above her, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember something close to stillness. Not calm exactly. Something more earned than calm. The stillness of a person who is prepared for the thing that is arriving and knows not with certainty but with reasonable confidence that the preparation was sufficient. Above her, separated from her by 7 feet of earth and a floor of heavy timber, Montana was doing its worst. In Samuel Greer's cabin, the first night of the storm was a battle conducted in 2-hour intervals. He and his wife took turns through the night, each sleeping, while the other fed the fireplace because the fire could not be allowed to drop below a certain point. When it dropped, the cold came back into the room from every wall, simultaneously fast and decisive, and it took 30 minutes of active burning to push it back out. The children were piled under every quilt the family owned. Their breath was visible in the air above their faces, even with the fire running strong. By the second morning, Samuel had burned through more wood than he had planned to use in a full week. He stood at the door of the woodshed and did the arithmetic and felt the fear settle into his chest with the patient weight of something that intends to stay. If the storm ran 7 days, the wood would not last. He would be burning furniture by day 5. He thought about the chamber under Nora's barn, about descending into it 2 weeks ago, about the thermometer reading in the middle of the afternoon with no fire burning. He stacked what he had as tight as he could, covered it with canvas against the snow, and went back inside. At the Webb place, Isaac's father, a man of 72, who had survived 40 years in rough country through a combination of stubbornness and good judgment, started coughing on the second day of the storm. It was the deep, wet cough that Isaac recognized, the kind that settled into old lungs and did not leave quickly. Isaac moved his father as close to the fireplace as the old man could bear and kept the heat running high and watched the wood pile with eyes that were doing the same arithmetic Samuel Greer was doing across the valley. He thought about Nora Hadley telling him to watch the eastern corner in spring. He thought about 2 hours at her kitchen table and 4 pages in Francis Cole's notebook. He stacked another log on the fire and listened to his father breathe. The second full day of the storm brought something new, a cold that had no interest in negotiating. The temperature that had been brutal became something beyond that, a stillness of air so frozen it seemed to have weight pressing against every wall and door and window in the valley from all directions at once. Isaac's fireplace roared continuously, and the far corners of his largest room still held ice. The windows on the north side had gone opaque with frost, so thick that the glass itself had lost its transparency. That afternoon, Thomas Aldridge stood in his own kitchen in the best-built house in the valley and counted what he could hear. Wind against his double-thick walls, his wife Ruth moving in the room above, and a silence from the eastern side of his property where his barn stood, a silence that was telling him something he did not want to hear. He went out in the storm to check the animals and came back inside with the expression of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of a conversation he thought was already finished. The animals were alive, but 2 cows were not eating and stood pressed together in the deepest corner of the barn, and Thomas knew that pressed together stillness. He had seen it before. He came back in Maud and said nothing to Ruth. He stood at the kitchen window and looked east toward the Hadley place and could see nothing through the blowing white. Ruth watched him. She had been watching him since the storm started, watching the arithmetic in his eyes, watching him count the wood and count the days and come up short both ways. She had heard what Francis Cole said at the schoolhouse about Nora Hadley's underground room before the storm came. She had kept it to herself the way you keep something you are not yet sure what to do with. "Thomas," she said, "if the Hadley woman built what Francis says she built, her animals are not cold right now." Thomas did not answer, but he kept looking east. Francis Cole's chimney clogged on the third night. The wind had been driving snow horizontally all day, and by evening it had packed the upper flue with a density that cut the draw almost completely. Smoke began backing into the cabin, thin at first, and then thicker, filling the space near the ceiling and working its way down. Francis opened the door to clear it, and the storm pushed back with a force that nearly knocked her sideways, driving snow into the room in a white surge before she could pull the door shut again. She stood in the dark cabin, smoke curling above her, the fire dead, and made her decision. She wrapped herself in every blanket she had and sat in the chair nearest the wall that faced away from the prevailing wind. Then she took her notebook out of her coat pocket, the one with Nora's chamber measurements in it, and she kept writing. She was not writing to document the storm. She was writing because she had discovered in the course of that December afternoon in the chamber that what Nora had built was not just a winter shelter. It was a solution to a problem that had been killing people in cold climates since people first tried to live in them, and the solution was simple enough that anyone with the right information and a willingness to work could replicate it. She wanted that information to exist on paper in enough detail that it could not be lost. She wrote by the light that came through the frost-clouded window, the pale gray light of storm-reflected snow, until her fingers were too stiff to hold the pen. Then she put the notebook inside her coat against her chest, where her own body heat would keep it from freezing. In the chamber beneath the barn, 3/4 of a mile away, Nora was sleeping. On the third night of the storm, she did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark after she had checked the children and confirmed the temperature and verified in her own mind that everything was functioning the way it should be. And then in the specific quiet that existed in that space below the reach of the wind, she let herself think about the eastern corner. Isaac's words had stayed with her. The clay layers, the lateral water movement, the signs in early March when the ground started to soften unevenly. She had done what she could to reinforce the drainage. She believed it was enough. But she had built this chamber once, and believing something was enough was different from knowing it, and she could not know it until spring came and the ground did what it did. This was the part of building that James had never talked about directly, the part that lived after the construction was finished, when you had to trust the work you had done in the dark with bleeding hands and no one to check your measurements. James had built things people still used. She had watched him finish a project and walk away from it with a steadiness that she had never quite understood. She understood it now. He had trusted his own hands, not because he was certain there were no mistakes, but because he had done everything he knew how to do, and certainty was not available to anyone at any price. She was going to have to trust her hands the same way. She was going to have to wait for March and see. Above her, Annie shifted on her pallet and breathed out a long, slow sigh, the deep, contented sound of a child in complete comfort. The sound moved through the chamber and settled against the stone walls, and Nora lay still and let it reach her. Last February, that same child had been breathing in the short, effortful pulls of someone fighting for each one. Nora had sat on a cold floor and counted each breath like a coin she was afraid of losing. She closed her eyes. Whatever March brought, she would fix it. The same way she had fixed the eastern corner in October. The same way she had fixed every problem in this chamber one at a time with the tools she had and the knowledge she could gather, and the willingness to keep going after the moment when stopping would have been easier. She slept. On the fourth day, the wind dropped just enough. It was not over. The cold had not broken and the snow was still coming, but the sustained howl that had made it impossible to hear yourself think above ground eased by mid-morning into something that allowed movement. Samuel Greer stood at his window and looked through the frost-edged glass toward the Hadley place, 3/4 of a mile east, and saw what he had been watching for and dreading in equal measure. No smoke, not a single trace of it rising from any chimney on the property. The cabin chimney was cold. The small roof vent on the barn, the one he had never paid much attention to before, showed nothing. His stomach tightened in a way he recognized. He had felt it before in other winters when a neighbor went quiet and the silence lasted too long. He strapped on his snowshoes. The walk that usually took 20 minutes took close to an hour. The drifts in the low places between the properties had piled to chest height, and he moved through them, slowly breaking trail with each step, his breath coming in short, hard bursts in the cold that had settled back to somewhere well below zero. Snow had crusted over in the night, and the crust broke under his weight unpredictably, so that each step was a small negotiation between the surface and the man crossing it. He thought about the conversation in the barn in December. He thought about Nora saying you can mention it if you want, and the steadiness of her voice when she said it. He thought about the thermometer he had seen on the chamber wall, the number he had stood in front of for a long moment before he climbed back out and said nothing. He thought about what it would mean if he opened that barn door and found silence where there should have been warmth. He pushed the barn door open against a drift that had piled against the base, forcing it with his shoulder, and stepped inside. The air was cold, but not the killing cold of the open. It had the cold of an unheated space that is still protected from the wind, a different quality entirely, a temperature that sat somewhere between survivable and comfortable. The two horses stood in their stalls with their heads up, ears forward, watching him with the mild curiosity of animals that have been well cared for and have no particular anxiety about the world. The milk cow was standing at her feed trough. Fresh hay had been pulled down from the loft. Someone had been in this barn that morning. Samuel stood still and listened. Then from beneath his feet, from beneath the boards he was standing on, he heard a child's voice. It said, "Mama, is someone up there?" The voice was clear and unhurried and entirely unafraid. Samuel Greer stood in that barn for 3 seconds without moving, with the sound of that voice in the cold air around him, and felt something happen in his chest that was not fear and was not relief, but was something larger than either. It was the recognition of a thing he had almost understood in December and was only now understanding completely. He said, "It's Samuel Greer. I came to check on you." A pause, the sound of movement below. Then the trap door lifted and Nora Hadley's face appeared in the opening, lit from below by lamplight. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes were steady and calm. "We're fine, Mr. Greer," she said. Not surprised, not shaken, not cold. Just there below the barn floor, below the storm, below all of it, as though she had been waiting in perfect patience for the world above to finish what it was doing. Samuel looked at her face in the lamplight and understood with the full weight of a man who has seen enough of life to know when he is standing in front of something true that he had been wrong about Nora Hadley. Not wrong about her character or her intelligence. Wrong in the specific way that most people in the valley had been wrong. He had looked at her situation and seen fragility when he should have seen preparation. He had looked at the bucket of dirt in the yard every morning and seen desperation when he should have asked what she was building. "Come down," she said. "It's warmer down here." He came down. Samuel Greer stood at the bottom of the ladder and did not move for a long moment. He had been inside the chamber once before in December, when the storm was still weeks away, and the cold was merely the ordinary cold of a Montana winter, and the whole thing had existed for him as an interesting idea that a woman he respected had decided to test. He had stood in the warmth then, and felt it, and acknowledged it, and climbed back out, and gone home, and told himself he understood what she had built. He had not understood it. He understood it now. The difference between knowing a thing intellectually and knowing it in your body after 4 days of fighting a fire that would not stay hot enough, in a cabin that would not stay warm enough after standing at the woodpile, doing arithmetic that had no good answer after walking through chest-high drifts in below-zero cold, while dreading what he might find at the end of the walk. That difference was not small. It was the difference between a map and the territory the map describes. He was standing in the territory now. Nora set a cup of water on the table and sat across from him. Owen was reading by the lamp. Annie was awake on her pallet, watching Samuel with the direct curiosity of a child who finds visitors interesting. The lamp threw steady light against the stone walls. The thermometer on the wall read 53 degrees. "How long have you been down here?" Samuel asked. "Since the afternoon before the storm hit," Nora said. "We come up twice a day to care for the animals. Otherwise, we've been here." 4 days, Samuel said. 4 days, she said. He looked at his hands on the table. They were cracked and red from the cold, the knuckles dark at the joints, the way hands get when they have been going in and out of extreme cold repeatedly with no real chance to recover. He turned them over and looked at the palms and then looked up at Nora. "I came expecting to find something bad," he said. "I know," she said. "I need to tell you something," Samuel said. He said it to the table more than to her, which is the way a man speaks when he is not entirely comfortable with what he is about to say. "In December, when I came here and saw what you had built, I went home and I told my wife it was clever. That was the word I used. Clever." He paused. "I said it like it was a surprise, like I hadn't expected you to be capable of it." Nora waited. "That wasn't right," he said. "It wasn't a compliment. It was a way of saying I'd underestimated you without admitting that I'd underestimated you." The oil lamp moved slightly in a breath of air from the ventilation pipe, and the shadows on the stone walls shifted and settled again. Annie had gone back to looking at her quilt. Owen had not turned a page in a while. Nora said, "Mr. Greer, you walked an hour through a blizzard to see if we were alive. I'm not going to argue with you about the word clever." Samuel looked up at her. "But if you want to make it right," she said, "tell people what you saw in here. Not clever, just what it is." He nodded. That was the whole of it. He climbed back up the ladder and went out into the storm that still had days left in it, and Nora watched the trap door settle back into place above her and sat with her children in the warmth of the ground and waited for the world to be ready for what came next. The storm broke on the 6th day. It did not end with drama. The wind simply stopped, as though whatever mechanism had been driving it had exhausted itself, and in the silence that followed, the valley lay buried under a depth of snow that changed the shape of everything. Fences had vanished. The low barn roof at the Webb place had a visible sag at the center that had not been there a week ago. The road that connected the homesteads to Lewistown was gone, entirely replaced by an unbroken white plain that gave no indication a road had ever existed there. Families came outside slowly the way people emerge after a long darkness and blinking against the reflected light of an enormous sky. They stood in doorways and looked at what the storm had left them and began the quiet accounting that follows every disaster. What remained, what was lost, what could be salvaged, what would have to be rebuilt from nothing. The Greer family had burned through nearly their entire winter supply of wood. Samuel stood at the empty woodshed and looked at what remained with the stillness of a man who has already moved past the shock of it and is now simply facing what is true. His children were alive and healthy, which was the thing that mattered, but the winter was not finished and the wood was nearly gone, and he would need to spend the first week of the thaw cutting and hauling before the cold came back. At the Webb place, Isaac's father was alive but not well. The cough that had started on the second day of the storm had deepened into something that would require weeks of careful management, warm food and rest, and the kind of slow recovery that old lungs undertake reluctantly. Isaac moved through his property after the storm with a methodical efficiency that masked something Nora recognized when she saw it from a distance, the expression of a man who came closer to a serious loss than he had expected to, and is still processing the distance between what happened and what almost happened. Frances Cole's cabin had gotten through the storm intact but cold. She had spent 2 days under blankets waiting for the chimney to clear and had emerged pale and stiff, but with her notebook still dry and her notes complete. She had done her work in the cold so that the work would exist. That was who she was. And at Thomas Aldridge's place, the largest and best-built property in the valley, 3 cows lay dead in the barn. Ruth Crane came to the Hadley place alone on a Tuesday 8 days after the storm broke. Nora was in the yard splitting the last of her small woodpile, maintaining the surface appearance of a household that used firewood the way normal households use firewood when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up. Ruth rode to the fence and dismounted and tied her horse without being invited, which was not the behavior of a woman who was uncertain about whether she was welcome. She walked across the yard to where Nora was standing with the axe and stopped at a distance that was close enough to be direct and far enough to be respectful. "I owe you something," Ruth said. Nora set the axe down against the chopping block and waited. "I was the one who said it first," Ruth said. "In October, at the church, the word I used was poor. She said the word, the way you say a word you have been examining closely and found wanting. I said it in front of people who repeated it, and I said it in a tone that made it mean something worse than it sounds. I knew what I was doing when I said it. I told myself I was concerned about you, but concern doesn't require an audience." The yard was very quiet. The snow around them had the dense, packed quality of post-storm settling, and their voices fell into it and were absorbed without echo. "I'm not here because I feel obligated," Ruth continued. "Edward feels obligated. I feel wrong. Those are different things, and I want you to know the difference." She paused. "We lost 3 cows. Edward has been very quiet since we found them. He hasn't said your name, but he's been thinking about it. I can tell." Nora looked at her. Ruth Crane was a woman who had everything. Nora did not have a large house, a prosperous husband, social position, the particular ease of someone who has never had to wonder seriously whether they would be warm enough in February. None of that had made her malicious. It had made her thoughtless, which was a different thing, and she was standing in the snow right now, making a distinction between obligation and genuine remorse that most people would not have bothered to make. "Come inside," Nora said. She did not mean the cabin. She took Ruth to the barn, opened the trapdoor, and held the lamp over the opening. Ruth looked down without hesitation and climbed the ladder with the straightforwardness of a woman who has made a decision and intends to follow through with it. She stood in the chamber and was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the children's palettes neatly made. She looked at Owen's books. She looked at the hearth cold and dark in the mid-morning, and then at the thermometer, and she absorbed what the thermometer said without requiring an explanation of why it said it. "You haven't needed a fire," she said. It was not a question. "Not much of one," Nora said. Ruth ran her hand along the stone wall beside her. The flat-set sandstone that Nora had carried up from the creek bed in the wagon over a series of autumn evenings. She pressed her palm flat against it and held it there. "Edward wanted to buy this land," Ruth said. "He told me it was for your benefit. He believed that." She took her hand off the wall. "He wasn't lying to me. He was lying to himself, which is harder to fix." "He's not a bad man," Nora said. "No," Ruth agreed. "He's a man who decided he knew the end of a story before it was finished." She looked at Nora directly. "I did the same thing. I looked at you and I saw how the story was supposed to go for a widow with 2 children in a Montana winter. And I narrated it before I checked whether it was true. Nora said, the story went differently. Yes, Ruth said, it did. Ruth climbed out a few minutes later and rode home, and Nora stood in the barn after the sound of the horse faded and thought about what it meant that the first person to use the word poor about her had also been the first person to come and say it had been wrong. She thought about Edward and his wife, buried in 1871, and the 15 years he had been carrying that loss as a reason to believe he knew how these things ended. She thought about how a wound, if it goes deep enough and long enough, can teach a person lessons that are mostly true but not entirely true, and how the not entirely true part is the part that does the damage. She went back into the chamber, sat at the small table, and opened Owen's reader to the page he had marked and waited for her children to come down for lunch. Thomas Aldridge came 4 days after Ruth. He did not send word ahead. He rode up to the barn in the late morning and dismounted and knocked on the barn door, which was the first time in Nora's memory that Edward Crane had knocked on anything at the Hadley property. She opened the door, and he stood in the thin winter sunlight with his hat in his hands. Ruth told me she came, he said. She did. I want to see it, he said, if you'll allow it. That last phrase, if you'll allow it, was doing considerable work. It acknowledged without stating directly that this was her property and her construction and her decision, and that he had no standing to demand anything. Edward Crane had not spoken to her that way before. He had spoken to her as someone with experience, addressing someone without it with the well-meaning authority of a man who has decided he knows best. This was different. She opened the trap door. Edward descended carefully. He was a large man, and the ladder was built for a woman's proportions, but he managed it without complaint and stood in the chamber and looked around with eyes that Nora recognized from watching him at church and at community gatherings, the eyes of a man who is genuinely assessing something, not performing assessment. He examined the wall construction. He ran his knuckle along the joint between 2 courses of stone and nodded at what he found there. He looked at the ventilation pipe and traced its path in his mind to where it would exit on the barn exterior. He crouched and looked at the floor, the angle of slope toward the drainage channel, and stood again. He did not look at the thermometer. He had already understood the temperature from the moment he came down the ladder. You built this without help, he said. Owen helped with the hauling, Nora said. Without skilled help, he said. Without a carpenter or a mason. Yes. Edward was quiet for a moment. I offered to buy your land because I thought you couldn't survive here alone, he said. I want to say that plainly. Not that I was looking out for you, that I thought you would fail, and I wanted to give you a way out before you did. Nora said nothing. She had known this since October. There was no point in pretending she hadn't. I was wrong about what you were capable of, Edward said. I don't say that easily. I've been in this territory 20 years, and I believe I know what this country asks of people. I thought I knew what it was asking of you. He looked around the chamber one more time. I didn't know you were already answering it. He climbed back up the ladder. In the barn, standing by the horses, he turned to her and said, I want to build something like this under my main barn. I'd like to hire you to help me design it. Nora had expected this. She had thought about what she would say when it came in the long, quiet evenings in the chamber while the storm was still running above. No, she said. Edward looked at her. Ask Samuel Greer, she said. He's seen the construction closely enough to help you. Or ask Frances Cole. She has detailed notes on every measurement and material. She paused. This valley is going to build a lot of these rooms, Mr. Crane. That knowledge needs to belong to more than one person. I'm not going to become the woman you hire to build your things. Edward held her eyes for a moment. Then something in his face changed, some last resistance letting go, and he nodded. Cole has notes, he said. 4 pages, Nora said, in her own hand. He put his hat on and went to his horse. At the fence, he stopped and turned back one more time, and he said, My wife was 31 years old. It came out quietly without the controlled delivery he had used in October when he first told her. I've been trying to make up for that for a long time, in ways that weren't always useful to the people I was trying to help. Nora stood at the barn door and looked at him in the winter light. I know, she said. I'm sorry about your wife. He rode away down the road, and that was the last time Edward Crane ever offered to buy her land. They came through the rest of that winter steadily, and by March the snow began releasing from the upper slopes in the slow, patient way of snowpack that has had enough of being frozen. Nora watched the eastern corner. She watched it every day as the ground softened, as the air took on the particular smell of water, moving through earth as the lower fields began to show the first patches of bare ground in the places where the drainage was fastest. She watched the gravel channel and the sump in the soil behind the eastern wall, and she cataloged every morning what she found. What she found in the third week of March was a thin line of moisture along the base of the eastern wall. Not flooding, not the kind of failure she had feared. A seam of dampness about 8 inches long at the very bottom of the wall where the drainage channel met the stone, indicating that the gravel was working, but working at close to its capacity. She dug it out and added another 6 inches of gravel to the sump and repacked the soil behind the lower 3 courses of stone. It took one afternoon. Isaac Webb, who had come by to check on his prediction and found Nora already in the middle of fixing it, stood at the top of the ladder and watched her work. "You found it before it was a problem," he said. "You told me where to look," Nora said. Isaac came down and helped her repack the soil, working in silence beside her for an hour, in the way that people work together when they have moved past the need for conversation to manage their relationship. When it was done, he looked at the repair with the satisfied expression of a man who has been useful in the way he intended to be useful. "My father is better," Isaac said. "He was out of bed last week." "I'm glad," Nora said. "He asked me what I knew about underground rooms," Isaac said. "I told him I knew a woman who had built one. He asked if she'd be willing to talk to me about building one under our root cellar." Nora looked at him. "He should talk to Frances Cole first," she said. "She has the dimensions and the materials written down. Then come back to me with specific questions." Isaac nodded. "That's what I'll tell him." He climbed the ladder. At the top, he stopped. "You were right not to stop," he said. "In October, when the water came in, you were right to fix it and keep going." "I didn't feel right," Nora said. "I felt like I might be making a very expensive mistake." "That's usually what right feels like at the time," Isaac said. He went out, and Nora sat in the chamber for a while in the afternoon, quiet, listening to the sound of meltwater moving in the ground around her, a soft and distant sound like something shifting in its sleep. The walls held. The floor was dry except for the seam she had just repaired. The temperature read 55 degrees. "Spring outside, 55 degrees below it." Frances Cole published her notes. She sent them to the Agricultural Gazette in Helena in April, written up in the clear and organized prose of someone who had spent years learning how to make complicated things comprehensible to people who needed to act on what they learned. The article described the chamber under the Hadley barn in precise detail: the dimensions, the wall construction, the drainage system, the ventilation, the thermal principles that made it work. She had asked Nora's permission before she sent it. Nora had said yes without hesitation. The article ran in the May issue under the title, "A Method of Winter Habitation from the Montana Plains." Nora Hadley's name appeared in the second paragraph, and again at the end, where Frances had written a sentence that Nora read 3 times when the copy arrived from Lewistown. The sentence said, "The design described here was conceived and constructed entirely by Mrs. Nora Hadley of Lewistown, Montana Territory, who arrived at its principles through observation and necessity and executed them through skill and persistence." Observation and necessity, skill and persistence. Nora folded the Gazette carefully and put it in the wooden box beside James's thermometer. She did not show it to anyone that day. She sat with it for a while in the way you sit with something that names you more accurately than you expected to be named. By the following winter, there were 6 underground winter rooms in the valley. Samuel Grier built one under his barn with help from Edward Crane's hired carpenter, using Frances's notes as the primary reference. He got the drainage right on the first attempt because he had watched Nora repack the eastern corner in March and understood what to look for. His family spent the following winter burning a third of the wood they had burned the year before. He told anyone who asked, and some people who didn't, exactly where the design had come from. Edward Crane built the largest one naturally with heavier materials and more refined construction, but built on the same principles in the same configuration. He hired the carpenter and supervised the work himself, and he referred to it throughout the construction in conversations with the carpenter as the Hadley method. He did not advertise that he had once tried to buy the land of the woman whose name he was using, but he did not hide it either when someone asked directly. Isaac Webb extended his root cellar downward and added a living space that his father occupied through the following 2 winters without once developing the cough that had nearly taken him in the blizzard. Isaac's father was a man of few words and strong opinions, and his opinion of the underground room was expressed primarily through the fact that he moved into it in November each year and refused to come back up until April. Frances Cole did not build one herself. She lived alone and her cabin was manageable, and her contribution had been the documentation which turned out to matter more in the long run than any single structure. Her notes circulated beyond the valley, copied by hand, and passed from family to family across the territory, the way practical knowledge travels in places where printed information is scarce, through trust, through recommendation, through the testimony of people who had seen the thing work. Owen Hadley was 22 years old when he built his own homestead 14 miles north of Lewistown, on ground that was good for cattle and rough in winter. He spent the first autumn digging. His chamber was larger than his mother's, 10 feet by 14, and he added 2 small window wells with heavy glass set into them so that some daylight reached the space on clear days. He used the same stone setting technique, the same drainage configuration, the same ventilation angle. When his nearest neighbor, a young man from Illinois who was on his first Montana winter, watched Owen working and asked what he was building, Owen said, "A room that stays warm without much fire." The young man asked who taught him. Owen said, "My mother." The young man asked if his mother was a builder. Owen thought about that for a moment. "She was a woman who paid attention," he said, "and she had a winter that required her to use what she'd noticed." The young man asked if she would be willing to come and consult. Owen said she might, but Frances Cole's notes in the Helena Gazette were probably the better starting point, and he would give him the issue number. Annie Hadley became a teacher, as Frances Cole had been a teacher before her, taking the position at the Lewistown School when she was 23 and holding it for the better part of 3 decades. She was a good teacher because she had been taught, by example, that the most important questions are the ones that begin with why, and that the most important answers are the ones arrived at by observation rather than assumption. On the wall of her classroom, beside the map of the United States and the printed alphabet, she hung a drawing. She had made it herself from memory and pencil on a sheet of heavy paper, a cross-section view of a barn, and the chamber below it with the stone walls and the drainage channel and the ventilation pipe, all shown in their correct positions and proportions. Below the drawing, she had written a single line in her careful schoolteacher's hand. The line said, "She asked why the barn was warm, and then she built the answer." When students asked about the drawing, Annie told them the story. She told them about the winter she had almost died, and she told it from a 6-year-old's perspective, which meant she told it the way it had actually felt, as a darkness that came and went, and a warmth that was always there underneath, and a mother who was always in the barn in the mornings doing something that nobody else understood yet. She told them about the blizzard. She told them about Samuel Greer walking through the drifts and hearing a child's voice from beneath the floor. She told them about the neighbors who came one by one and stood in the chamber and felt something that changed how they thought about what was possible. She told them about Edward Crane not as a villain, but as a man who had learned something hard too late and then tried to pass it forward. She told them about Ruth, who had been the first to use a word carelessly and the first to retract it directly. She told them about Isaac Webb, who had come to argue and stayed to help. And she told them about Frances Cole sitting alone in a frozen cabin, writing in a notebook she kept inside her coat to keep it from freezing, because she believed that what one woman had built in the dark with bleeding hands was important enough to be recorded and shared. One year, a boy in the back row asked the question that Annie thought about for the rest of that school day. He said, "Was your mother scared?" Annie stood at the front of the room and looked at the drawing on the wall and thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said, "on the night in October when the water came in and she nearly stopped, and on the 3rd night of the blizzard when she was lying in the chamber, not sure whether March was going to prove her wrong." She paused. "But she did something that I think is harder than not being scared. She was scared and she kept going anyway. She fixed the drainage and she went back to sleep and she waited to see what March would actually bring, instead of deciding in advance that it would bring the worst." The boy thought about this. "And what did March bring?" "A seam of moisture along the eastern wall," Annie said. 8 inches long. She fixed it in an afternoon." The class laughed at that, the way you laugh when a story builds to something large and then lands somewhere small and real. Annie smiled. "That's usually how it goes," she said. "You're afraid of the catastrophe. What actually shows up is a problem you can fix in an afternoon if you've been paying attention." Samuel Greer lived into his 70s and was regarded by the newer generation of settlers in the valley as someone worth listening to, the kind of man whose opinion carried the weight of long experience honestly applied. He was not a man who talked about himself, and he was not a man who offered opinions he hadn't earned. But on the subject of Nora Hadley in the winter of 1886 to 1887, he spoke without hesitation when people asked, and sometimes when they didn't. He was sitting on the porch of the Lewistown General Store one summer evening, maybe 15 years after the blizzard, when a young man who had recently bought land in the valley and was preparing for his first real Montana winter, sat down beside him and asked him what he needed to know. Samuel was quiet for a moment, looking down the road toward the mountains. "There's a woman in this valley," he said, "or there was, though she's older now, and her children have their own places. She did something in the autumn of 1886 that everyone around here thought was strange. Dug a room under her barn. People talked about her the way people talk about someone who has lost their footing." He paused. "Then the worst blizzard in the territory's history came through, and when it was over, she was the only one who hadn't fought it. She'd just gone below it." The young man asked what the lesson was. Samuel looked at him. "The lesson is that practical looks strange until the crisis proves you right," he said. "And the corollary is that the people who think you're strange are usually the ones who didn't ask why you were doing it before they decided it was foolish." He stood up and adjusted his hat. "Go read the article in the Helena Gazette," he said. "May issue 1887. Francis Cole wrote it. Then go see the chamber under the Hadley barn if Mrs. Hadley will show you. She usually will." He started for the door. "And don't use the word poor about someone you haven't talked to. You don't know what they're building." He went inside. Nora Hadley lived on the same land for the rest of her life through decades of Montana winters that never again reached the specific ferocity of that January, though several came close enough to remind the valley of what the worst could be. Each autumn, she opened the trap door and went down to prepare the chamber for winter. She checked the drainage, replaced any stone that had shifted, refreshed the gravel in the sump. She lit the small hearth for 1 hour to warm the walls, and then she let it go cold and checked the thermometer. 55 degrees year after year, patient and unchanged the ground, doing what the ground does, regardless of what the sky decides to do above it. In the small drawer of the table that had been in the chamber since the first winter, she kept 3 things. James's brass thermometer, which she no longer needed for measurement, but which she kept because it was his. The folded Gazette from Helena with her name in the second paragraph. And a small piece of paper folded twice in her own handwriting. On the paper, she had written 2 lines. The first line was James's, "You have to learn from the ground." The second line was hers, "I did." She did not show the paper to anyone. It was not for anyone else. It was the private accounting between a woman and the work she had done, the kind of accounting that does not require an audience because the person keeping it already knows what it says, has always known, and needed only the time and the seasons to prove it to the ground itself. The ground had been proven to. The ground had held.